Today on The State of Us, Gen Z's national crisis. What can we do about it? Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined today by the one and only, your boomer-friendly redneck liberal, Mr. Lance Jackson. You'll note that I, made sure to point out that we have a boomer on the show.
Oh, I don't get to call you a millennial, but you get to
That's correct.
bash on me as a boomer.
That's how this works.
Okay. Well, I just want people to know before we start, I have many people that I admire as Gen Z, but we're gonna we're gonna kind of take a little bit of liberty with them here in today's show.
We're going to take liberty.
Yes.
Well, in fairness,
we're going to point out their shortcomings.
So two people of an older generation are going to talk down on a younger generation. Is what's about to happen is what we're saying.
Well, we're going to try to fix their problems for them.
Oh, okay.
If they'll just listen to us.
Right. That always goes
The voice of experience.
Yes. Exactly. Today we're looking at an article from the Wall Street Journal, an opinion piece, actually. And we're specifically going to look at some excerpts from Jonathan Haidt's book. He's working on a new one as well, but the one that he's most known for is The Coddling of the American Mind, which was released several years back.
Great book.
Yes.
I love that book. It's on my shelf at home. Have asked many of my fellow teachers to read it, have handed out copies of it. But anyway, go ahead.
So anyway, that's the gentleman we're talking about. He is a professor at New York University's Stern School of Business, and he talks about what he defines as a national crisis. He's 59 years old. He's a young boomer, and he isn't talking about millennials, some of whom are in their 40s by now. Rather, he has in mind the younger cohort, Generation Z, usually defined as those born between 1997 and 2012. When you look at Americans born after 95, Mr. Haidt says, what you find is that they have extraordinarily high rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm, suicide, and fragility. There has never been a generation this depressed, anxious, and fragile. He targets social media as one of the main concerns. But his research, which is confirmed by many others in the field, shows that depression rates started to rise all of a sudden around 2013, especially for teen girls. But it's only Gen Z, not older generations. If you stopped collecting data in 2011, you'd see little change from previous years. By 2015, it was an epidemic. His data, by the way, is available in an open source document online, so if you want to look at it for yourself, you can. What happened in 2012 when the oldest Gen Z babies were in their middle teens? What happened? Well, that was the year Facebook acquired Instagram, and young people flocked to the latter site. It was also the beginning of the selfie era. Apple's iPhone 4, released in 2010, had the first front-facing camera, which was much improved in the iPhone 5, introduced 2 years later. I had an iPhone 5S, and I remember when Snapchat in 2014 came out. I was a senior graduating high school at that time, and this is part of the beginning of the sort of swarm of the selfie era.
So you're right on that edge. You fall into the millennial time frame, but you're a young millennial or just on the outskirts of Gen Z. So you bring that kind of perspective. That's why I say that.
Right.
I'm not going to bash you yet, but you want to claim that you're a millennial, but you're really a young millennial.
I am a young millennial.
But you're on the cusp because 97 would make those people 25, 26 years old, the oldest Gen Zers.
Yes, the oldest Gen Zers.
And the youngest ones would be 10, 11 years old.
And again,
so basically
a lot of
we're looking 10 to 25-year-olds.
We actually did an episode too on the, on kind of those very interesting people, because actually, Lance, by definition too, is a young boomer. And we've talked about those people that are kind of in between generations and the interesting interesting way that sometimes manifests. But I think that a lot of the data that he's specifically talking about are the people that, and this is what he gets into, is people who mostly grew up, right, during this era. And I think
they're impressionable years.
Correct. And not that you're not impressionable when you're 17, but the whole point is that, I did not grow up with social media. Was it around? Yes. However, usually if you wanted to use social media, you had to sit down at a computer and use it. And
you've got mail.
Right. Yeah. You've
AOL. You've got mail.
You've got mail. And that was a thing at my grandparents' house, it was pretty cool when that took place. But the other thing is, and he draws this contrast, which I think is important to understanding as well. Millennials really, they had flip phones and they were texting, but that's a whole different world than social media. His point was most of what they used their phones for was simply to more quickly plan in-person get-togethers with friends. Mm-hmm. So I was part of kind of, in a lot of ways, the way I look at it is it was the beginning of that transition over, but it still wasn't, I didn't have the internet in my pocket easily accessible most of my middle school and high school years. It was coming, and it definitely by like junior, senior year was really starting to take shape. But you still had a lot of classmates who, for example, had like data restrictions on how much data they could use. So if you didn't have Wi-Fi, like you definitely weren't, you know what I mean? Like
you weren't on it all the time everywhere.
Right.
You were.
Because you couldn't be. You didn't have that option.
Right.
It's not like, oh, we're better, we knew we shouldn't be. It was just like, you just couldn't. So, and even, when I started texting on the first phone that I had texting on, I actually got in trouble that month because my mom came and like, why is there like $40 of extra charges on the phone bill? Well, that's because texting was still uncommon enough that you paid, like most phone plans were pay by the text, and you paid $0.25 for every text that you sent. Uh-huh. And I thought this was pretty cool. And I was basically just texting one person, and like $40 in phone expense. Like, then I quit texting for like 2 years, and then it came, but then they became part of phone plans. And just, I guess the point is that the difference between millennials and Gen Z is millennials were growing up with technology, yes, and the computer and all this stuff coming into the classroom, but a lot of their adolescence maturing had been completed, or they were most of the way through it before the era of socializing exclusively through a device really took hold.
So you understand that mindset that they have, but you didn't have the entire preteen, teen years indoctrinated by it. You had been part of a different world.
I really love his metaphor that he uses. Mr. Haight imagines literally launching our children into outer space and letting their bodies grow there. They would come out deformed and broken. Their limbs wouldn't be right. And that's because you can't physically grow up in outer space. Gravity is part of how we grow up. Human bodies can't grow up in space. Yet, that's basically what we do socially with our children. We launch them into outer space starting in the year about 2012, and then we expect that they will grow up normally without having normal human experiences.
Well, and I've talked to many of my friends, because I've been retired since 2015, officially from education. I've continued to teach at the university level and work at the youth center and substitute back into the district I retired from. So I've watched this develop, as you say, in these years. And I've talked to so many parents, and they're like, well, what am I supposed to do? I mean, all their friends have a phone. I get they want to feel a part of things. And then you have the helicopter parenting. I mean, do you remember? And I don't, maybe, and again, here I go sounding old, but I remember at that age, my mom and dad, 16 years old, they gave you the car keys and you got to go pick up your friends and go to a ball game or to a concert or whatever. And they had no way to get a hold of you. When you left the driveway at 5 o'clock that night or 5:30, 6 o'clock, and you started the rounds to pick up your friends, and you got home at curfew, which was, 11:30, midnight, 1 o'clock, whatever it was. Mine was fairly early, but for 5 hours, you were independent. And if something happened, you had to problem solve it with your group of people or by yourself if you were out driving around by yourself or going places by yourself. There was no phone to call anybody. There wasn't anything to look up. Your entire socialization was being around physical people doing physical activities, being around other people who were going to said ball game or concert or school event or church event or whatever. And you were constantly in contact with other humans. But you see these people that the author's talking about now, they're in constant contact with everybody through a device in their hand. And they have, and this is anecdotal, but working with the kids just this week at the youth center, we said, you have to put your phone over here. It's not going to leave the room, but it has to be off of your personage while you're doing schoolwork. And they have struggled all week staying focused, doing their schoolwork, because they're constantly looking over to where their phone is to make sure their phone's okay. They're not used to not having it on their being. It's like when I haven't put my wallet in my pocket, right? I sit down, it's like, oh crap, I left my wallet at home, because I can feel it there. They're the same way with their phone. They are struggling to function in the classroom because they don't have it on their person. They're not looking at it. They're not texting. It's not being disruptive to the learning environment. Just the fact that it's physically not on them, and they're 17 years old, and they're that attached to it. There is something wrong with that when that's the majority of their time for human interaction is taking place on that device.
Well, and the whole point is there's a lot of adults that have similar feelings. The big difference is that, again, they grew up in a world and they did a lot of maturing and growing up before that became a thing. And again, they point out that basically we've deprived a lot of our children of the normal toughening and the normal strengthening, the normal anti-fragility practices that would happen. Before 2010, teenagers had flip phones, and really all they could do was text. The other thing that coincided with this, like you mentioned, is the helicopter parenting. What they found is that the data shows us what age, one way that we can measure that is at what age were children allowed to go outside on their own. At what age did parents allow that to happen? Well, it had risen from the norm of previous generations, where it used to be 7 or 8, to between 10 and 12.
We stunted their growth and development because we're keeping an eye on them so much.
For those that don't know, Lance is father of girls. Mr. Haid especially worries about girls. By 2020, more than 25%, 1 in 4 female teenagers, had a major depression. The comparable number for boys was just under 9%. Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. There's a lot of potential consequences that could come out of a more fragile generation, not the least of which is a potentially more fragile workforce. Bosses have been reporting, and managers, that it's very difficult to supervise Gen Z employees who are entering the workforce. And the reason is because it's complicated to give them feedback in a way that they can actually make use of it.
Before I comment, Justin, the word of the day is flout, a verb, to flout, to treat with contemptuous disregard or scorn.
So not flaunt.
But not flaunt, because interestingly enough, there has been confusion about these two words since the 1900s. Flaunt means to display ostentatiously, and most usage commentators consider it an error to use flaunt with the meaning to treat with contemptuous disregard. So be careful. We're not flaunting anything, but we are trying not to flout our disregard for Gen Z, because we're honestly trying to deal with the emotional difficulties that the author of the article that we're referencing today says comes about because of the use of the phone and the selfie and pictures, and for the high anxiety rate among 10 to 25-year-olds.
So it's important that we make the careful distinction between flout and flaunt, because they actually aren't the same thing.
They are not the same word.
Although you could do both simultaneously, I suppose.
You could flaunt something and then flout.
Because flaunt is the display of the thing.
Right.
Flout is the actual like mental state.
To indulge in the scornful behavior.
Yeah. Okay.
So actually doing it.
Okay.
So you can put it out there, or we can actually do it. And we're trying not to do either one.
Ideally.
Right.
Ideally. Well, and that's actually kind of the point that Mr. Haight has been making. He is not scornful, and he doesn't have any apathy toward the young. And he calls millennials amazing. Older folks make fun of them, but he says that's part of the normal teasing across generations that you get going back to Plato.
That's what I tell you all the time. I'm just teasing you.
To illustrate his point about Gen Z, Mr. Haight challenges people to name young people today who are really changing the world, who are doing big things that have an impact beyond their closed ecosystem. He could only name two. By contrast, he says millennials remade the entire world through their youth, though not necessarily for the better. Mark Zuckerberg, for example, born in 1984, founded Facebook when he was 20 years old. And Zuckerberg's not the only example. I mean, basically, most of your modern social media companies, and big tech companies were founded by millennials. Now, you can argue that that's not for the better per se, but they had done big things that had transformed the world in one way or another. And his whole point is, we're not seeing that same thing happening with Gen Z like we've seen with other generations. Usually, there's a few big names.
Now, see, I think he's flouting it a little bit there.
Yeah, you think so?
Because
he's being an old grump?
I think a little bit he is, because that's really not fair, because half of that generation isn't even 20 years old yet.
Well, and he concedes. He says,
give him time.
His judgment may be premature. It could be that you'll see some impact in 3 or 4 years by the time they're reaching 25, 30. But I'm predicting that they will be less effective, less impactful than previous generations. Why? You should always keep your eye on whether people are in discover mode or defend mode. In the former mode, you seize opportunities to be creative. In the latter, you're not creative. You're not future thinking. You're focused on threats that are in the present. I thought that was another
that's a good point, because
good way to think about the mindset difference. The other thing is, a lot of millennials, when you think about their relationship early with technology, and I mean, mine definitely was this way. I was just constantly amazed by it. I thought it was fascinating, super interesting. I mean, we actually did a show on this network for years about new technology, because myself and the other person that hosted the show found that stuff to be really any apathy toward the young. And he calls millennials amazing. Older folks make fun of them, but he says that's part of the normal teasing across generations that you get going back to Plato.
That's what I tell you all the time. I'm just teasing you.
To illustrate his point about Gen Z, Mr. Haight challenges people to name young people today who are really changing the world, who are doing big things that have an impact beyond their closed ecosystem. He could only name two. By contrast, he says millennials remade the entire world through their youth, though not necessarily for the better. Mark Zuckerberg, for example, born in 1984, founded Facebook when he was 20 years old. And Zuckerberg's not the only example. I mean, basically, most of your modern social media companies, and big tech companies were founded by millennials. Now, you can argue that that's not for the better per se, but they had done big things that had transformed the world in one way or another. And his whole point is, we're not seeing that same thing happening with Gen Z like we've seen with other generations. Usually, there's a few big names.
Now, see, I think he's flouting it a little bit there.
Yeah, you think so?
Because
he's being an old grump?
I think a little bit he is, because that's really not fair, because half of that generation isn't even 20 years old yet.
Well, and he concedes. He says,
give him time.
His judgment may be premature. It could be that you'll see some impact in 3 or 4 years by the time they're reaching 25, 30, but I'm predicting that they will be less effective, less impactful than previous generations. Why? You should always keep your eye on whether people are in discover mode or defend mode. In the former mode, you seize opportunities to be creative. In the latter, you're not creative. You're not future thinking. You're focused on threats that are in the present. I thought that was another
Well, that's a good point because
good way to think about
Yeah.
the mindset difference. The other thing is a lot of millennials, when you think about their relationship early with technology, and I mean, mine definitely was this way. I was just constantly amazed by it. I thought it was fascinating, super interesting. I mean, we actually did a show on this network for years about new technology because myself and the other person that hosted the show found that stuff to be really interesting. But we want to try new technology.
Well, the change
we
was
want
coming
to,
so fast and doing
right.
and we just did a show a couple of weeks ago about 5G and how it's a big disappointment because it hasn't followed up as quickly as everybody thought. It's been developed, but there aren't really the tools to use it. And to me, AI has been out there, but it's just now starting to make some changes. Back when you were at that impressionable age of a millennial, the new iPhone was doing new things every year. Anymore, it's like, this is the same thing as it was before, and they just made you change to get a new.
Right. It's lost some
money.
of the.
It doesn't happen as
razzle-dazzle.
quickly because it was like anything else, right? In the earlier stages, changes happen more quickly
And they're more noticeable.
Right.
It's not really that change. I mean, when you look at things that are changing from phone to phone, they're getting better, but a lot of the changes are things that you don't see or feel on a regular basis. For example, if a security patch is released every month, if the security patch works, you don't know that it's working. You know what I mean? That's kind of the point. But if you look at early on with phones and how often they got software updates, a lot of times they got updates less frequently, not more. And now you get more updates more frequently, but a lot of times they're minute changes or incremental improvement, and those are harder to see or feel, and they're not as exciting. So I guess the point about the discover versus defend mode, I think is well taken, because when I think about what my relationship growing up with technology was like, is it was very rarely fearful. You know what I mean? It was almost always, this is cool, this is interesting, I want to try this, I want to experiment with it. And even as social media came out, a lot of us were pretty, and that was a thing for a while, pretty risky with what we were doing with social media. And now it's almost the opposite of what you've seen of.
Except the evolution of the technology has led to the anxiety of the generation following the millennials. These Gen Z kids are almost afraid. They use technology. Here's the dichotomy, right?
They use it, but they're afraid of it.
They use it more than anybody else, but they're fearful about what can happen to them when they expose themselves and their thoughts to it.
But yet it's the only way they know how to communicate.
And so therefore, that leads to the anxiety that they feel, because I must use this because this is the way I can connect with other people. However, every time I put myself out there, either in words or in pictures, I'm fearful of how I'm going to be received by all these people that I need constant reassurance that I'm doing the right thing. I hope I explained that well, because that's what I see, is that they need their phones to connect with the outside world. However, they're so afraid of how the outside world is going to receive whatever it is that they put out there, whether it's ghosting or catfishing or or woke people saying they're not going to talk to them anymore because of something they've said or taken a picture of. And to your point, they're at that age when they're just experimenting. And the millennials were allowed to just experiment, and nobody was going to come crashing down upon you. Whereas Gen Z is experimenting. They're at an age where they're going to experiment, but they're constantly being put down or attacked or bullied for what they're putting out there when they're in the discovery and learning age. And so it's made them truly full of anxiety, because the only thing they have that they know how to communicate with other people is also where they're being bullied the most.
And they want the social, they want to be better at it, but when you've not learned how, it's super difficult. Though, as you were talking,
and nobody's shown them how.
Right. Well, that's what I mean. Where these other generations, even if they had helicopter parents, right, they had developed some semblance of more traditional human interaction prior to total exposure to social media. So they had a frame of reference. You know, the problem is you have a lot of Gen Z who don't have that frame of reference, you know?
Well, like even if I was out and had a flat tire, there were things called payphones every few blocks. So I could walk a couple blocks, put a coin in a phone and call my parents and get some help. So I could be alone, but still feel connected. These kids today that make up Gen Z, they're almost constantly connected. So they don't have that opportunity to develop and grow up like I did, because they're never disconnected from their parents because the phone is always there. So, and we see this happen every day that we deal with them. Anytime there's conflict, before they try to solve the conflict among themselves, they pull out their phone and text or call their parents and say, I'm in the middle of a conflict. And then what happens? The parents come and try to solve the problem for the children because their youngster is under attack. And while some people would call that good parenting, I don't know about you, but there were a lot of conflicts that we settled on the ball field or in the car or in the restaurant on our own as teenagers without it ever including any adult. And that doesn't seem to happen for Gen Z. They're always including their parents. And it's not always the parents including themselves. The kids are including, I'm having this problem, Mom, come and help me solve it. Whereas at 13, 14, or 15, we were out running around, and if we had a problem, we had to solve it ourselves. And our parents never found out about it, you know, unless you came home with a black eye or something.
Or they just ignore the problem completely, because if it's happening in the digital landscape and you're not even physically with the other person it's happening with, you ghost them. I'm just not going to talk to them. You know, that's how we're going to fix the problem, is just ignore it. And so one of two bad things happens. Either they resolve the problem, but they didn't do anything to solve it on their own, or they don't resolve it at all because they just ignore it and hope that it goes away. Both of which don't develop stronger.
Don't develop maturity.
Right. Don't develop maturity. They just, which would explain part of why managers are saying, you know, so far we're having a lot of trouble with Gen Z workers because we give them feedback and then they feel like they've been attacked and then they do a worse job, you know, and it's like, and that's not what they're trying to do either.
Well, whatever happened to constructive criticism?
Yeah.
Because, you just criticize me. How can it be constructive? Well, because I'm trying to help make you better. And you're not even listening to it. No, because it's criticism.
Mr. Haight says that social media is incompatible with liberal democracy because it has moved conversation and interaction into the center of the Colosseum. We're not there to talk to each other. We're there to perform before spectators who want blood. If social media is incompatible with liberal democracy, or at least if it's incompatible with our youth, is there a solution? Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. Mr. Haight has some good metaphors. I'm not sure about you, Lance, but I think...
that's why I loved his book, The Coddling of the American Mind.
Yeah,
it's
the Colosseum is a great way to think about it.
It is.
We're not doing what Lance and I are doing, right? We're not sitting around a table and talking about a problem with a couple of people. We're moving into an arena and we're letting everybody watch what's going to happen. And we're having people root and take sides and keep score. And we want to see drama and we want to see blood. And we don't want to see two people who are having a civil conversation, because that wouldn't be very entertaining in the middle of an arena.
So is it the device that's bad, or is it the way that we're using the device that is bad?
I think what we've covered is it's a multi-tiered issue. Perhaps the biggest single issue is how quickly do you get full access, basically unmitigated access to social media? How soon does that happen? And that's exactly the question that we posed at the end of the last segment. Is there a solution? Well, if you ask Mr. Haight, he says, I'd raise the age of internet adulthood to 16 and enforce it. 13-year-olds right now today, this isn't him anymore, this is the opinion piece. 13-year-olds right now today can legally sign up for social media sites, and millions of much younger children than 13 use them. They just lie about their birthdays. The internet teaches them that all you have to do is lie and you can get access to anything. That's what we've taught kids so far, and it has to stop. And there's a whole other thing there going on about.
I'm the old person in the room, but I couldn't agree more, because there were things, and I always told this, and I asked my dad this too, my mom. I said, what happens when my kids start asking me questions? They're growing up. Well, why does this happen? Well, what's this? They said, well, you give them the least amount of information to answer their question, because you don't want to deny their inquisitiveness. You want them to ask questions. That's how we learn, right? The whole Socratic method is by asking questions. So you want to encourage the questions, but you don't go in and give them the whole detail of what's going on. It's like, well, where do babies come from? Well, you don't go ahead and pull out the pictures and put, a pornographic movie on the screen and say, here you go, you're 5 years old, here's how babies are made, right? You don't do that. We didn't do that. But what phones do now, right, and the internet, it allows those 5-year-olds to do that. And so the point is, you gave them the amount of information to satisfy their query, and then they went off and played. And then they'd come back 6 months later, and you'd give them
question
and have another question. And again, you didn't tell them everything, but you didn't lie to them. You gave them the amount of information that was necessary for them to quit asking, because that was what their mind was really interested in. But what we've done with that whole method now is handed these young kids a phone, and they have a question about something, they put it on the internet, and they have access to all the information, and it's not being deciphered or filtered by a parent who's just giving them what they need. They're getting stuff that they don't know what they're even looking at or what they're reading. And then their young minds are confused because they're not mature enough to handle all the things that are being thrown at them. And as parents, before the internet, we got to do that. We didn't say, well, you're too young, or at least I never did, and my wife never did. We answered their question until they went off to play again, and whatever amount of information that was necessary, because that was the amount of information that their mind could handle at that age. The internet doesn't allow us to do that anymore. They don't have to ask. There's no adult in the room, and then they gain access to things that they are not mentally mature enough to deal with. And what do we end up with? These anxiety-ridden young people, and it's not their fault. Whereas if we put some age limits on it, and there's the key word there, phrase was enforce it, which I'm not the technological guru to understand how you would do that. But if that's possible, that it can be enforced without the parents being involved, because in many cases, it's like if I was having to raise these kids now, which many grandparents, people my age are, I don't have to, luckily, they would know more about how to gain access to it than I would know how to put filters on it. So it's got to be done by a third party somewhere. That's my take on it. And I think most in that realm is why it needs to be done, because we've totally skipped a whole segment of growing up and parenthood with the use of technology.
Well, and I mean, the opinion piece also points out that in the physical world, we have more than 100 years of making things safe for children. We require car seats and seat belts. We eliminated cigarette vending machines. We have fences around pools. By contrast, life went on to the phone-based apps 10 years ago, and the protections we have for children are zero. Absolutely nothing. The damage to Generation Z from social media so vastly exceeds the damages from COVID that we're going to have to act. And I guess I agree with that a lot in the sentiment of this problem is new. The notion of us as a society saying, hey, this thing is harmful to children. We need to do a thing about this. That's not new, but we've always focused on physical well-being. And this is an assault on mental development of our youth, and arguably as serious or more serious than some of the physical things that we've protected them against, you know?
So do you think it will be, because the average age of a U.S. senator is like 60 something? I mean, and you're expecting them to make law. You've ranted and raved about that for the last 3 or 4 years.
Make laws for these.
You know, how are they supposed to make laws for this new technology that they have no clue how to use or what it does? Is it going to take Gen Z becoming parents to lead the push to get this out of the hand? I mean, where's the leadership going to come from? We talk about that on this show almost daily with the topic. Where's the leadership going to come from to do this?
There may be a glimmer of hope because adolescents apparently have a little bit of an inkling of their own predicament. Mr. Haidt has addressed classes of 7th and 8th graders in his research on the perils of social media. He said, I asked them, would you get off social media on your own? Many are afraid to do that. But when I ask, what if nobody could be on social media? Would that be better? The majority say yes.
The whole peer pressure point.
Gen Z
I don't
says,
want to be left out, but if nobody else can, I'm okay
right,
with that.
They're not in denial. They recognize that this app-based life is bad for them. And he reports that they wish they had childhoods more like those of their parents in which they could play outside and have adventures with their friends. They see the point of getting off social media, so long as it's not just targeting one child, it's targeting all children. I believe Gen Z would be very supportive of that. That's because that's part of the problem. And it is a predicament, I think, for parents too, because it's that whole question of, yeah, we're going to save them from the perils of social media. But at the same time, if I'm the only one that does it, what other unintended consequences have I now caused? Because we can make light of peer pressure all we want, but for when you're growing up, social media or not, peer pressure is a huge component of your mental well-being. And if you then become the target and you are ridiculed, by the way, on the very social media that you're not allowed to be on, now you don't even have a way to defend yourself, you know, all this stuff can happen and be said, and you may not even know that it's taking place. And all of a sudden you have no friends, nobody will talk to you, and they all hate you, you know, and they all think you're weird. And there's nothing you can do about it because you don't have a way to interact with them. And so I'm saying that because I don't want to make light of the like, well, you just be a good parent and take it away. Like, yeah, I guess I come down on the side of I still think that's probably less damaging. But as a society, I think we have to get serious about that doesn't fix it. That's only a partial fix because you have to get across the board an agreement on when it becomes okay to do this. Just like we decided, you know, for example, that in the state of Ohio, you're not going to use, it is not going to be legal for you to vape or smoke until you're 21 years of age. Because the data keeps coming out, here's all these bad things that happen, especially if you're